So, it wasn't just coincidence, Silas thought to himself. There's no doubt about it now. That kid can absorb my ability, regardless of what form I put it in. First it was that monster that I had. Now, even the water. It seems like regardless of what I throw at him, he can just open his gaping maw and down it goes. And he keeps piling it on. Just like my own ability, it can act as armor, protecting him from harm. Now he's basically inside of a big dragon suit, and I just kept feeding him. Yeah, this is definitely gonna be difficult. I have to combat him while ensuring that I don't feed him. Scattered long-range attacks, regardless of whether I use phantoms that I summon or material elements, will just absorb them. So, that only leaves physical attacks. I need to get up close and personal, and make sure he doesn't gulp down any more of my power. Thankfully, he doesn't know its limitations. So, the first things first, I have to break through that armor, get to the real kid underneath. Okay, kid. Round 3, Silas said, as he bolted down in Talian's direction. Talian's form, now massive, covered entirely in that thick white fog, with a slight silvery sheen to it. Suddenly, his tail began to shift. His size changed somewhat, as part of the fog that created his body shifted back into his tail. From that long, fog-based tail emerged massive blades protruding from the end of it, like an enormous battle axe at the end of his tail. Even the tail itself extended, becoming even twice as long as it was before, and with it he lashed out at Silas, one strike after another swinging. Now Silas did his best to maneuver around the blows, some of them striking the ground, slashing enormous marks into it as it tore through earth like nothing. Flying around rapidly, Silas began to make his way towards Talion again. Talian's new massive form opened its mouth, breathing in a short spell and then releasing another bolt of fire, one after another firing in Silas's direction, and one after another he evaded, bolting out of the way just in time. As he closed the distance between the two, suddenly the massive cloak around him spread out, and from it an immense hand emerged, grasping out at Talion, ensnaring his entire body. The axe on his tail flailed into it, gashing into the fog-based form of the hand. It slashed in, but the arm didn't dissipate, no matter how many times the Talion cut into it with that tail, and the grip around him only strengthened. Suddenly Talion was lifted off of the ground, spun around in a circle, like that giant hand was on a whip and was now being spun around. And then, with a single motion, he was slammed into the ground, sending nearby pieces of rock flying from the impact. And after that he picked him up, slamming him again and again. Momentarily, Talon managed to grasp himself, clinging onto the ground as his form shifted again, the fog creating even larger claws that dug deep into the ground, preventing him from being lifted. As he opened his mouth again, spewing another gout of fire in Silas's direction, he had to release the hand for a moment, forming a defense, as the stream of fire billowed over his form. Finally coming to an end, Silas's form shot from the fiery wake of the attack, rising out of the flames in a stream of fog, up into the air again, making an overhead loop back towards Talion. Again, Talion flailed that long tail out at him, swinging again and again, not managing to gain purchase on an attack. And just as He was about to close in the last bit of distance. Suddenly, the fog-like form shifted, and there were 4 different versions. 4 streams of fog shooting off in different directions around Talion, each one landing on a different side, forming a square, a box-like shape around where he was, landing to the ground. They all looked identical. No telling which one was the real one. All of them with those billowing white cloaks. All at once they attacked. From the white cloaks they wore on their backs, massive weapons and appendages started to form. Arms and hands, enormous balls attached to chains striking at him. One of them simply started to form chain after chain, wrapping around Talion's form, attempting to bind him down, while the others just kept attacking. One after another hit, pounding into Talion's massive form, all of them moving quickly, as Talion was swinging around that blade on the end of his tail, slashing at them. But it was too slow, and he was unable to get a hit on any of them. With his neck now lengthened out, that too was lashing and trying to make attacks. Back and forth in all directions he lashed out, clawing and whipping, biting, trying to ensnare even one of them, and failing, as the chains that wrapped around him grew ever tighter. The countless attacks from all directions were overwhelming. Suddenly, Talon's form began to curl in on itself, as if it was guarding itself, reeling in its long head and neck, and even its tail, curling inward. For a moment, as if it was afraid to make an attack, afraid to take another attack, and then a low, guttural growl began to emit from its form that only intensified every second. Suddenly, Talion's entire form caught fire, all of the fog that made his body bursting into flame, red-hot scorching heat emanating from it, and suddenly the chains that surround him burnt away, evaporating back into fog and mist dissipating. Suddenly Talion was free again, and once again began lashing out, now no longer stuck in the same place. His fiery claws dug into the earth below him, propelling him at great speed as he began to rush around the battlefield, leaving flame in the wake of everywhere he did, all in the shape of giant, monstrous claw marks dug into the ground, the giant cleaver shape on the back of his tail swinging out, lashing one attack after another as his mouth opened once again, breathing in small bursts of air and releasing massive bolts of fire in all directions. A flurry of attacks in order to try to hit them. One of the duplicates was hit, and in an explosion, dissipated. Luckily for Silas, it wasn't the original. From Talon's form, suddenly began to emerge 2 more massive shapes. Sprouting from his back were massive fiery wings that began to beat, lifting Talon off the ground, each one emanating massive amounts of heat, scorching the ground as he lifted off, taking to the sky. Okay, so now he's airborne, Silas said, looking up at him as he took to the air and started circling, glaring down on the battlefield. But as he did, his form began to diminish, shrinking down ever so slightly, moment by moment. Okay, so the same rules do apply, Silas said, looking up at him, circling. Sorry, but my powers aren't unlimited use, kid. Every time I create something with the fog, it uses up the energy that I imbued it with, dissipating into regular steam. The more intense what I create is, the more powerful I force it to be, the faster it burns away. And fire? Kid, fire is a doozy. It's extraordinarily powerful, but It burns through the fog quickly. Good. Just keep plucking away, kid. Eventually, we'll get down to the real kid underneath. I'm surprised he actually knew how to change its form, though. He's learning to use those abilities way too quickly. But at least on the good side, it doesn't appear that he can actually create the abilities once he absorbs them. He only has use of how much he takes from me. It's a limited supply, based on what I allow him to take, and he's burning through it. After that, all that'll be left is his own energy, and I just gotta make sure not to keep feeding him. Talion began to sweep down, breathing fireball after fireball, gouts of fire at all of them. Occasionally he would land, trying to make direct attacks with the axe on the back of his tail, or slashes, bites, anything trying to lash out at them to kill the enemy he was facing. Little by little, the flames surrounding him began to dissipate, his form shrinking with every passing moment. The destruction to the area around was immense. A sea of craters, billowing with fire and smoke. Trees turned to ash, grass burned to nothing, stone melted down. Eventually, Talion managed to whittle his way through the other two, duplicates, leaving only Silas left. But at that point, Talion's massive fiery form had diminished down to basically nothing. He could actually see Talion again. Now, the fire only covering a portion of his body. Both his head, portions of his chest, his right arm, his tail, were all once again visible. The rest covered in those gouts of fire, billowing off of him. But it was a tricky trade-off. Sure, the diminishing in size decreased his overall destructive capabilities, but Silas also noticed that the more fog that came off, that dissipated, the faster that Talion became, no longer encumbered by being surrounded by that fog. In the form of flames, he could now move much faster. The entire combat at this point was a flurry. Talion was a non-stop offensive. Relentless attacks, one after another, slashes, fireballs, streams of fire, even attempting to bite into him. But he was also breathing heavily. The intensity of the fireballs that he produced was starting to dwindle, no longer having the immense destructive force that they did before. They were still very dangerous, but had lost much of their kick. Silas was holding up much better than Talion. He was nowhere near as physically exhausted. After all, his power allows him to bypass much physical exertion. He doesn't rely on physical strength. But the battle hadn't left him unfazed. Talion was not weak by any measure, and only using the amount of power that he was, Talion had managed to gain a strong hit. One of his claw attacks managed to swipe past, slashing into his left arm. Luckily, the sheer heat scorched the injury, limiting the bleeding, but the blood loss was starting to get to him, and he had used quite a bit of energy maintaining his cloak. Unlike Talion, who had to absorb the ability from him, he could replenish the cloak as much as he wanted, but he also had a limited supply of energy to provide to that. "Okay," Silas said. "I think it's just about time we end this, kid. I have to admit, you're one hell of a kid. Once you actually learn to control your abilities, get nice and trained up, I'm not sure if even I am gonna be able to beat ya. But as for right now, I'm sorry, but you're just not strong enough. It's time to end this game," he said, dodging another of Talion's attacks as he rushed forward, slashing out with one of his claws. Suddenly, a series of hands burst forth from the cloak, gripping Talion from all sides, and once again beginning to whip him about, slamming him into the ground over and over again. After the fifth slam, suddenly, he rushed up. the hands forcing Talion to the ground, pinning him. As he lifted his arm, reaching out, grasping Talion by the mouth, the fog swirling around it suddenly formed a wrap, tying itself tightly around Talion's head, keeping his mouth shut. The last thing he needed at this moment was to feed him more power or catch a bolt of fire to the face. But it was time to end the show. At that moment, a massive skeletal form burst forth, rising from above them, fog drifting from it. As it clutched, its skeletal fingers closed into a fist, swinging down into Talion's head, smashing him into the ground. For a moment, Silas stood back, waited to see if Talion was still up, as the giant skeleton moved back, lifting its hand, and there in a crater lied Talion. As he stared down at him, he didn't seem to be moving. The fire that had now cloaked most of his body seemed to dissipate, going away altogether. As at that point, he began to see it. Talion's long horns, curled backwards, had begun to retract themselves, shrinking back into his body. The vibrant silver glow that had started to encompass his hair, making it look like it was adrift, dulled down back to the regular silver appearance that it normally had. It was clear at this point. Talion was unconscious. "Oh, thank God," Salas said as he walked towards Talion laying on the ground, wanting to take a closer check. After getting close and checking his pulse, making sure that the kid was alive and okay. Other than some scuffs and bruises, he seemed fine. A nasty bump on the head, but it's nothing that he wouldn't live through. Silas's body was in agony. That single strike that he took had not only slashed into his left arm, but scorched it, burning away much of the clothing that he had. And as he finally allowed his cloak to dissipate, you could now see the myriad of scorch marks on his clothing and body, from fighting in the midst of all of the fire, being hit by ambient pieces of stone from the explosions, and all of the minor injuries that were inflicted on him. Silas stood up from checking Talion's state, looking down at him laying unconscious on the ground. "Ugh, just look at you. You don't have any idea how much trouble you put me through, do you? I bet you don't even know what happened. And unlike you, I'm not a high-level demon. You're probably going to wake up tomorrow feeling like $1 million with no clue what you did. I, on the other hand, am going to be healing for freaking ever. It's going to take like a week for this to get better." "Well, at least it's over," he said, still gazing down at Talion. "Let's just hope your mom doesn't freak out that we, burned down a sizable chunk of the forest. I'm sure she's worried about her sweet little Talion. But you're going to be one hell of a kid. So congratulations, brat. You have successfully passed day 1 of training. Now, all that's really left is to actually teach you how to use all that power, which is actually a pretty terrifying concept. But what the hell? I'm gonna do it anyways," Silas said as a smile began to emerge on his face, wary though it may be.